Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, J.D. Salinger. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-sized biographies are now available on YouTube Music, Spotify, and please tell a friend about Bite-sized biographies. Now let's get started with our story about J.D. Salinger. On July 16, 1951, the writer known as J.D. Salinger published a short novel entitled The Catcher in the Rye. The book concerned 3 days in the life of a 16-year-old fictional character named Holden Caulfield. This was Salinger's first novel, and despite having a reputation for composing compelling and impeccably crafted short stories that were published in such reputable magazines that included Story, the Saturday Evening Post, and the preeminent short fiction periodical of the day, The New Yorker, there was little expectation in the publishing world of the impact of The Catcher in the Rye. Immediately both a bestseller and controversial, the book's staying power lasted beyond its initial release to become one of the most prominent works of American fiction ever published, to date having sold over 65 million copies. The book had a special appeal to 20th century adolescents, reading it an emotionally poignant rite of passage along the route to adulthood. But The Catcher in the Rye also changed the trajectory of the author's life, Salinger abandoning both the cultural and literary environments of Manhattan for a tiny New Hampshire hamlet. Almost as beguiling as the novel he wrote, the only full-length publication of his lifetime, Salinger's life became a mysterious and reclusive existence marked by occasional neurotic interactions and personal relationships, especially with young women, that could only be described as bizarre. Jerome David Salinger was born in Manhattan, New York City, New York, on January 1st, 1919. His father, Solomon, was from Cleveland, Ohio, descended from Lithuanian Jewish immigrants. His mother, Marie, was born in the small Iowa town of Atlantic. Both of her parents died around the time that she met her husband, and the circumstances surrounding Saul and Marie's relationship remain murky. What is certain is that the couple were married in the spring of 1910, and Marie moved into the Salinger family home in Chicago. Saul's father was a successful doctor, and Saul's family accepted Marie as one of their own, despite her Gentile background, Marie obliging by changing her name to Miriam. In fact, both J.D. Salinger and his older sister Doris never knew that their mother was not Jewish until they were well into their teenage years. At the beginning of J.D.'s parents' marriage, Saul operated a movie theater, which eventually went under. Forced to find more traditional employment, Saul Salinger went to work for a meat and cheese importing company known as J.S. Hoffman. In late 1912, he was perceived as diligent enough to earn a promotion to the position of general manager of the company's New York operation. Quite an achievement. The position also required that Saul move his family to New York. Like most Americans, Saul Salinger prospered greatly in the Roaring '20s. He relocated his family several times, always to more prestigious addresses. As the family's financial status improved, J.D.'s parents seemed to consciously downplay his father's immigrant Jewish roots. The children did not regularly attend synagogue and celebrated both Jewish and Christian holidays. Saul Salinger also began to alter his own family history, claiming eventually that his parents were born in Ohio. J.D. Salinger initially attended public schools, but his father's financial resources also eventually enabled a private school education, and at age 13 he was enrolled in the McBurney School, a private school on Manhattan's West Side. This 1932 development also coincided with the entire Salinger family relocating to their final family residence address at 1133 Park Avenue, on the southeast corner of Park and 91st, a very prestigious neighborhood on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Salinger's enrollment also underlined especially his father's concern that his son lacked focus and had unrealistic professional ambitions. As a child, J.D. Salinger was quite close to his mother, who shared his sense of humor and encouraged his interest in drama and creative writing. When Salinger was expelled from McBurney for poor grades and told his father he wished to study acting, his father was dismissive, emphasizing that such a pursuit at the height of the Depression was completely preposterous. The conflict between father and son was also influenced by the strong will of Miriam Salinger, who was certainly no shrinking violet in her marriage. Quite possibly to escape from the ever-increasing tension between himself and his father, J.D. agreed with his parents that he should attend boarding school. But surprisingly, instead of some rarefied upscale New England institution, Salinger was packed off to Valley Forge Military Academy in Pennsylvania. His father also did not accompany his mother and sister to drop him off. The eventual theory that in a potentially anti-Semitic environment, Saul Salinger did not want his participation to generate such potentially negative reactions to his son. Considering Salinger's previous lack of academic focus and a proclivity for the arts, a military academy had all of the makings of a complete disaster. Instead, for the first time, Valley Forge's structure and strict discipline seems to have been exactly what the teenager needed. Not only did his grades improve, but he also was a participant in the school's drama club, appearing in every play that this group produced, and he served as the literary editor of the Academy yearbook, both participations explaining why his photograph appeared frequently throughout the annual publication. He emerged from this institution, seemingly back on track, his exact professional goals still unclear, but with at least a general determination that he would pursue a literary career in some as yet undetermined specific undertaking. However, after enrollment at NYU in September of 1936, this momentum quickly dissipated. New York City and Greenwich Village distractions, a complete lack of daily structure, and the ability to hang out at his parents' apartment, resuscitating the academic dysfunction of Salinger's earlier years. He left NYU in the middle of his second semester. His poor grades eventually would have ultimately resulted in his expulsion. Saul Salinger then decided to intervene, hoping that he could possibly interest his son in a more grounded, realistic career path. However, he disguised this as an opportunity to further develop Jerry's language aptitude, his son, in April of 1937, to accompany another Hoffman and Company business partner who managed purchases and operations in Austria and Poland. Salinger would be based in Vienna and live with a family in the city's Jewish quarter, his sojourn lasting for about a year. He not only wrote about this experience in some of his earliest short pieces, he also eventually spoke with acquaintances about this family, especially a teenage daughter on whom he had developed a serious crush. Although the daily specifics of Salinger's apprenticeship are unknown, at some point this older associate, one Oscar Robinson, dropped dead of a heart attack, and Jerry was told to relocate to a company apartment in the Polish town of Bodegatz. He spent the remainder of his time in Poland, accompanying various employees of what was essentially a slaughterhouse, observing more than a few colorful characters, but also coming to a permanent conclusion that his father's line of work was of no interest. Fortunately for Salinger personally, and unfortunately for Poland and Austria, it became increasingly clear that the tense international European situation would worsen, and this region was no place for a Jewish-American expatriate in his late teens. In March of 1938, Salinger made his way to Southampton, England, and a French ocean liner that conveyed him back to New York City. At this point, Salinger, with very few other options, then decided to enroll in another college, a tiny liberal arts institution, Ursinus College, in a rural part of southeastern Pennsylvania. The school, a former seminary founded by the German Reformed Church and populated at the time by mostly Pennsylvania Dutch students, seemed another unlikely academic destination for Salinger, and what specifically prompted his enrollment there is a mystery. During his brief time at the school, his coursework concentrated mostly on literature, and while he did join the college newspaper and contributed a frequent column, again he lasted only a semester. This time, however, his exit was prompted not by poor grades or unhappiness, but by a newfound resolve that he knew exactly what he wanted to do professionally, and he needed a different academic regimen to appropriately pursue such an objective. From his parents, he sought neither approval or advice. He merely dramatically announced that he had decided that he would become a writer. Predictably, his mother gave him her blessing and encouragement. His father, not so much. After having spent much of the Depression providing his family with, under the circumstances, a remarkably privileged standard of living. At this point, the tension between father and son was tangible, the relationship argumentative and tense. None of this deterred Salinger from his next step on his newfound literary quest. He enrolled in 2 classes at Columbia University, a short story class that was taught by Whit Burnett, and a poetry class taught by Charles Hanson Towne, actually a much more esteemed playwright. Because Salinger had an interest in drama and acting, as well as fiction, he decided exposure to Towne personally would be productive, even if that came through composing poetry as opposed to plays. Taking Burnett's class was also an obvious choice. The professor and his wife were the founders of Story magazine, a small circulation publication well thought of in literary circles. Burnett was enthusiastic about discovering new talent, and eventually he would be the first publisher of Tennessee Williams, Norman Mailer, Truman Capote, as well as the literal mentor of J.D. Salinger. But all of that was very much in the future, Salinger spending most of his first semester on the periphery of the class, composing little and generally wasting his time. So much so that he decided to re-enroll in Burnett's class again in the fall of 1939. This time he must have realized that to get anywhere as a writer required more than just mere ambition. He began to participate in class to the extent that Burnett began to recognize a potential talent and interacted with Salinger on a close advisory level. Rather than his typically aloof, sarcastic self, Jerry was very grateful for this attention, and a close professional bond developed. But Burnett provided more than just academic guidance. He encouraged Salinger to submit a short story Jerry had worked on in class entitled The Young Folks to Collier's Magazine, one of several popular publications of the time period that published a great deal of short fiction. The story was rejected, but upon hearing of this development, Burnett requested a copy for himself. Most likely, Burnett already had decided on what he would do with The Young Folks, but for several weeks he did not render any formal judgment directly to Salinger. He made him wait, most likely to instill in his pupil the understanding that professional writing is filled with both rejection and uncertainty. However, in January 1940, Story officially informed the young writer that The Young Ones would appear in the spring edition of Story magazine. It was about 2 young people who meet at a cocktail party and contain much of the snappy dialogue and attributes of much later Salinger efforts. The writer was ecstatic and now completely sure that he would pursue writing as a career, so much so that he did not re-enroll in any courses at Columbia. Just turning 21, his first literary sale paid him $25. J.D. Salinger's initial success was followed by months of formal rejection from various different high-profile literary entities, but he was officially retained by the literary agency of Harold Ober and was personally represented by the firm's Dorothy Olding, who also represented Pearl Buck and Agatha Christie. How much this had to do with Salinger's connection to Whit Burnett is unknown, but the young writer was now repped by the same agency that famously handled F. Scott Fitzgerald. This initial headway only amounted to the sale of one other short piece entitled Go See Eddie, which wound up in a literary review published by the University of Kansas. But that was it, and for the rest of 1940, Salinger sold nothing else. He was broke, still living with his parents, and probably looking to get away from what was not the happiest of environments. He and a Manhattan buddy got jobs as social coordinators on an ocean liner of the Swedish-American line, the SS Kungsholm. On a 19-day Caribbean trip, Salinger danced with female passengers, played deck games in the daytime, and performed in dramatic presentations at night. He enjoyed this temporary job, but seems to have suddenly gotten the inspiration to join the military upon his return to New York, again looking for a lengthier solution to his domestic situation. Unfortunately, he was classified as 1B, the result of a slight heart issue, not medically serious, but enough to prevent his enlistment in peacetime, the military not as yet desperate for mere warm bodies. The exposure to the military, although personally humiliating, did prompt Salinger's more mercenary instincts, with the composition of a traditionally positive and short piece on the travails of a new recruit. It was quickly published in July of 1941, in Collier's with an illustration and on one page. It would also appear in the 1942 and 43 editions of the Kit Book, a collection of cartoons and literary pieces that was issued to soldiers of the American military for their personal amusement. By the summer of 1941, Salinger was now a published writer in some high-profile periodicals and even book collections. Among his social circle was a former military academy classmate who was the brother of Elizabeth Murray, a married New York socialite in her early 30s, who already knew of Salinger and his recent success. The Murray family had a home on the Jersey Shore and was close to the high society members of the community that included their debutante daughters. During the summer, Salinger crossed paths with women like Carol Marcus, the eventual wife of William Saroyan, and later Walter Matthau, Gloria Vanderbilt, and especially intriguing Una O'Neill, the 16-year-old daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill. Despite her youth, she was considered a stunning beauty, and she also knew of Whit Burnett, who had worked with her father. At 22, published and sophisticated, Salinger appealed to her, and when they both returned to Manhattan at the end of the summer, they struck up a relationship of sorts. Fairly early on, Salinger recognized a fundamental problem when he mentioned privately to Elizabeth Murray that little Una is in love with little Una. Although they would have formal dates at various trendy New York night spots, the relationship would only go as far as possible, considering that Salinger's love interest was not old enough to even order a cocktail legally. The young writer also began to obsess about getting published in the New Yorker magazine, the pinnacle of the American literary establishment, as well as the possibility that this would impress Una even further, to the point of solidifying a more passionate relationship. The New Yorker seemingly obliged him in October of 1941 by accepting a short story entitled Slight Rebellion off Madison. This actually was a fragment of a novel that Salinger was in the early stages of both organizing and writing, concerning a male prep school student on Christmas vacation. The boy's name is Holden Morrissey Caulfield, and the story contains all of the prototypically caustic observations on upper-class society that eventually made this character extremely famous. Although the magazine indicated eventual publication, there were no specifics, but this positive interest indicated to Salinger that he was on to something, and he began to focus on developing this character and other characters in the Caulfield family, ultimately leading to a total of 9 stories, and eventually the novel that Whit Burnett, among others, was urging the writer to compose. Unfortunately, this professional accomplishment did nothing to improve his relationship with Una O'Neill, their interaction deteriorating to Salinger mostly sending her long letters and placing an occasional phone call. Ironically, most of Salinger's published work at this point centered around the falseness and banal high society and the pretense of its members, while he personally pined over a shallow but beautiful debutante, the epitome of everything the writer supposedly detested. Into this relationship dysfunction, reality drastically intruded on December 7, 1941, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. While this shocking development galvanized America, it also had another immediate effect on Salinger personally. The New Yorker informed him that they would not be publishing Slight Rebellion Off Madison in its next issue, and indicated that they might permanently shelve the story. Undoubtedly, considering the national mood of anxiety and emergency, an account of an immature teenager lamenting his unfulfilling but privileged existence seemed quite trivial and inappropriate. Salinger was predictably crushed by this development, additionally by his military classification, which, at that time, with most of his contemporaries lining up to enter the military, rendered him unfit for military service. Suddenly, Salinger, a 23-year-old living at home with his parents, realistically at the edges of the literary profession, and now, after bragging to his entire social circle that he was about to be published in the New Yorker, having to explain this and other rejections, was faced with a personally mortifying situation, especially in how little Una would perceive him now. This melodrama never really unfolded, as the U.S. government interceded in April of 1942, the draft board notifying Salinger that he was now qualified for induction into the Army. Like most Americans, Salinger looked at this development positively, eager to patriotically serve his country. He would also escape his suffocating domestic situation, the military now replacing his skeptical father's reproach. Salinger no longer an immature neurotic lying around his Park Avenue living room. He was a fighting man for the nation's defense. Reporting for duty at Fort Dix as a private, typically Salinger immediately applied for officer candidate school. He was rejected, instead being accepted into training with the Army Aviation Cadets. Salinger was pleased to learn that Burnett had accepted another of his stories entitled The Long Debut of Lois Taggett, the tale of an attractive debutante and the harsh reality of her relationships and existence treated with Salinger's typical cynicism and judgment. Burnett was probably hoping to keep Salinger interested in his literary efforts despite the distraction of serving in the Army during wartime. He repeatedly encouraged Salinger to finish the novel the writer had certainly discussed with him, Burnett not only believing it might be something very special, but also potentially economically beneficial if Story was able to publish such a groundbreaking work. Although the Army initially seemed to interfere with Salinger's ability to maintain such an extracurricular activity by stationing him in the middle of nowhere at Bainbridge, Georgia, it ultimately recognized Salinger's capabilities. Bainbridge was the home of the U.S. Army Air Corps Basic Flying School, and Salinger was to be a classroom instructor. With his nights free, he would be able to keep writing, but he resisted both Burnett's and his agent Dorothy Olding's requests for something lengthier, claiming that military life made that difficult. Even then, Salinger did not like what he considered controlling behavior. He was also spending a great deal of his free time composing long letters to Una O'Neill, revealing his true feelings and telling her that he loved her in very flowery prose that he possibly hoped would impress her. Instead, she showed it to her circle of female friends, flattered by the attention but certainly not smitten herself. Her ambitious mother, Eugene O'Neill's ex-wife, Agnes Bolton, most likely discouraged any relationship with Salinger. Bolton instead prompted her daughter to relocate to Los Angeles, ostensibly to become an actress. By the fall of 1942, Una was focused on a completely different social setting and priorities, and Salinger's lengthy letters received no response. The only updates he got came from the gossip column revelations in January 1943 that Una was now very visibly involved with the actor Charlie Chaplin. They met when Chaplin was supposedly casting a film, and Una, despite zero acting experience, auditioned for the lead role. The movie Shadow and Substance was never made, but Chaplin, who had a notorious fondness for very young women, immediately became romantically involved with Una O'Neill, a relationship of which her mother, also in Los Angeles, would have heartily approved. Not only the age difference of 36 years, but Chaplin's already tawdry personal life turned this romance into a tabloid sensation. Chaplin's first two wives were both 16 when he impregnated and then subsequently quietly married them, the marriages only lasting briefly, his second wife receiving a then record $600,000 divorce settlement in 1926, but not before tales of Chaplin's alleged perverted sexual appetites and rampant infidelity became public. At the time that Chaplin met O'Neill, he was being sued for paternity by an actress named Joan Barry, a suit despite a blood test that indicated that Chaplin was not the father of Barry's child. He lost. Because Chaplin was also known to profess leftist political tendencies, he was also subjected to prosecution under the Mann Act, which prohibited the transport of a female across state lines for illicit purposes. This prosecution resulting from J. Edgar Hoover's personal desire to embarrass and even possibly incarcerate the actor. Such hostility eventually led to Chaplin, during the McCarthy era, fleeing to Switzerland. Amidst the current front-page chaos, Una O'Neill and Chaplin married on June 16, 1943. Although he outwardly barely acknowledged this result, Salinger was deeply hurt by the development. Even his Army colleagues knew of his infatuation with Una. Photos of her formerly visible in Salinger's workspace and living quarters. But Salinger threw himself back into his writing, successfully selling short pieces to Collier's, Story, and the Saturday Evening Post. He also was transferred several times to various Midwest locations, dead-end assignments that meant promotions, but nothing truly interesting, and Salinger quickly lost any enthusiasm for the Army itself, believing it ultimately an incompetent operation. However, military necessities and one of Salinger's unusual abilities propelled him to an assignment that completely changed the course of his military service and even the rest of his life. With the invasion of Western Europe, the military recognized the need for a group of specialists responsible for gathering intelligence from the local population and identifying enemy elements concealing themselves within captured areas. Any collaborators, former Nazi officers, attempting to escape identification and capture, and saboteurs were of special interest. This group, known as the Counterintelligence Corps, were to be embedded within the regular infantry, and Salinger was designated as one of these agents. Typically, the Army did this not as a result of recognizing any innate intelligence or skill on Salinger's part, but simply as a result of Salinger's ability to speak both French and German. The writer's last stateside assignment was for training at Fort Holabird near Baltimore. He spent much of his free time writing, and in early January he was informed that the Saturday Evening Post had purchased 3 of his stories. He immediately informed Whit Burnett, who must have been less than happy with this development, having rejected the same material. Burnett persisted with his demands for a novel, and perhaps this was his way of steering Salinger in that direction. Although Salinger also reassured Burnett that he would eventually complete such a project, this latest sale also emboldened him. To editors of The New Yorker, he forwarded another story for consideration, with stipulations that it not be altered in any way, and not a single word changed or removed. This resulted from The New Yorker asking him to again greatly revise and shorten Slight Rebellion off Madison for possible future publication. Needless to say, Salinger's demand was met with anger and disdain from a very prestigious but self-important group of editors who rejected his latest story and again shelved Madison. This dispute was interrupted when the Army drastically disrupted Salinger's writing career. On January 18, 1944, he was placed on a troop transport bound for Liverpool. He arrived safely there by the end of the month and immediately proceeded to the vicinity of Tiverton, southwestern coastal England. He also spent a great deal of time in London, continuing his CIC training, now a staff sergeant within the 12th Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division. Tiverton was a typical small English town with little to do other than walk its ancient streets and wander into a pub. Salinger was able to write, but predictably not much from this period was of merit. Even the writer's letters indicated a great deal of distractive introspection. Not surprising considering the potential consequences of the impending invasion. The writer also had a less than positive reaction to the Saturday Evening Post's treatment of the eventual publication of his 3 stories, copies sent to his overseas location. Titles were altered without his permission or even pre-publication knowledge, but what he found especially disturbing was the appearance of his work meant to be thoughtful and compelling were overwhelmed by numerous slick advertisements featuring celebrity endorsements. Instead of accepting the reality of publishing in a highly commercial forum, Salinger began to develop a resentment towards editors of such periodicals, personally decided that in the future he would avoid them, despite the high prices they paid. On October 28th, only weeks before the scheduled invasion, Salinger was involved in an operation that was meant to simulate conditions that soldiers would experience when they were actually deployed on the beaches of Normandy. Men were packed into large LSTs, a large craft with a mouth-like opening that disgorged tanks, men, and equipment directly onto a beachhead. Their destination was Slapton Sands on the southwestern coast near Plymouth. The first disastrous aspect of this operation occurred on the morning of April 27th, when there was confusion as to when live shelling of the beach would occur. The barrage delayed by an hour, but some participants not receiving proper notification. This resulted in a friendly fire incident in which hundreds of soldiers were killed or wounded, the exact number still unknown as the military clamped down on any public information concerning this incident. Even worse, the next day, German patrol boats were attracted to the area by obvious massive activity, and they were successfully able to sink some of the LSTs, resulting in more losses. Again, over 700 men died, many drowning as they sank immediately, weighed down by packs and without proper implementation of life preservers. Salinger's immediate responsibility was, with other CIC personnel, to head to hospitals treating the wounded to ensure no news of this fiasco escaped to the outside world. Medical personnel ordered to not speak to the wounded, and this directive enforced by armed CIC personnel who literally stood guard in operating rooms. While specifics of the disaster did not become public, internally the operation was a major intelligence problem for the Allied invasion effort. Knowledge of its mere existence a tip-off to Germany that an invasion was imminent. For Salinger personally, witnessing this disorganization and having for the first time to view the dreadful results up close in the form of terribly wounded and dead soldiers was another experience which added to his increasing cynicism over the military's ability to competently conduct its mission. Some biographers have questioned what exactly Salinger experienced while serving in the Army during his 11 months following the D-Day invasion. Granted, his assignment to the CIC made his everyday responsibilities different than a typical frontline soldier, But this did not mean that Salinger was not involved in serious and potentially very dangerous combat situations, starting with D-Day itself. His experience was the same as thousands of other soldiers who were loaded onto troop carriers days before the invasion, locked down in port for several days before his and many other ships in one of the largest military convoys ever deployed reached the vicinity of the Normandy coast on the night of June 5th. On the morning of June 6th, amidst a massive artillery barrage, Salinger boarded a small landing craft jammed with over 30 other soldiers. He was part of the second wave that landed at approximately 6:40 a.m. on Utah Beach. Salinger caught several breaks that morning, the first that he completely avoided the carnage of Omaha Beach, the second that his particular wave landed 2,000 yards south of their actual objective, which was not as heavily mined or defended, and the third that once successfully ashore, his unit was able to access a virtually undefended causeway to facilitate progress off of the beach and further inland. In fact, the 12th Infantry Regiment successfully penetrated over 5 miles into hostile territory, one of the most successful efforts of the initial assault. Subsequently, the unit was then ordered to head north and aid in the capture of Cherbourg, the vital port that was necessary to facilitate the resupply of the nascent invasion. It would take several weeks, but eventually Germans began to surrender in large numbers. This was where Salinger and his CIC cohorts needed to prioritize who to interrogate, even attempting to extract information from locals as well as prisoners. On July 1st, following the surrender of Cherbourg, Salinger's unit and the rest of the 4th Division was ordered back to the vicinity of Utah Beach for 3 days of rest. Of the 3,000 men who had come ashore as the 12th weeks earlier, only 1,130 remained. Salinger's regiment would go on to experience the highest casualty rates of the war. For the next 6 weeks, German resistance remained fierce until combined air and land offensives finally allowed Allied forces to break out of the Normandy pocket and rapidly approach Paris. Like many American soldiers, Salinger fully enjoyed liberating the French capital, making his way down French boulevards in his Jeep, he and his colleagues mobbed by wildly enthusiastic Parisian crowds. Salinger also had the presence of mind to seek out Ernest Hemingway, knowing that the famous writer would be holed up at the bar in the Ritz Hotel. Sure enough, the great writer was there and was responsive enough to have claimed to have heard of Salinger and to have even read some of his stories. Salinger gave him a copy of the Saturday Evening Post containing some of his work, and the two men talked about literary matters. J.D. later recalled that Hemingway was quite friendly and down to earth, not at all the domineering, pretentious celebrity one might have expected. With the occupation of Paris and the rapid advance throughout the rest of German-occupied France, optimism permeated Allied forces that the war was approaching a rapid conclusion, the High Command believing that Germany would capitulate by Christmas. Unfortunately, this attitude faded as German resistance became much more determined once the invasion approached Germany itself. In early September, the 12th Regiment crossed into Germany via a 50-square-mile region known as the Hürtgen Forest. This area was fortified with a series of bunkers, fortifications, landmines, and booby traps that comprised part of the vaunted Siegfried Line, the defensive position constructed to resist just such an invasion. Initially, Salinger's unit made progress, but the Germans responded with a counterattack undertaken by SS armored panzer divisions, and much more familiar with the territory, they induced a deadly quagmire. As the situation stalemated, the weather got colder, and American troops started to die from exposure as well as combat. Equipped for a quick summer invasion without overcoats and boots that weren't waterproof, conditions became extreme. This contributed one of the costliest and ultimately pointless exercises in the entire war. These heavy casualties and terrible conditions could have been avoided by merely bypassing the entire area, but Allied commanders were determined to subdue this objective. It was not until early December that Salinger's division, utterly decimated, was withdrawn from the region. Only 563 soldiers were left in Salinger's regiment from the original 3,080 that entered the Hurtgen Forest. For a week in the small Luxembourg town of Echternach, Salinger and the 12th enjoyed what for them must have been a heavenly assignment, in which they slept in actual beds, showered, ate food that wasn't canned, and got clean uniforms. Their respite lasted about a week, until the great German offensive known as the Battle of the Bulge commenced, Salinger's unit standing directly in the way of a major German armored attack. Pushed back initially, eventually the 12th and other Allied units would halt this onslaught, retaking much of the territory already seized. Salinger would actually enter Germany again via the Hurtgen Forest, by now neutralized, with Salinger's unit now mostly motorized, and by the end of March he crossed the Rhine into Bavaria. It was during this part of the war that Salinger's skill as an intelligence operative was most crucial. With the capture of each new German town, it was left to men like Salinger to implement fundamental occupation, locking down communication and transportation capabilities, observe and analyze the local populace for possible saboteurs or high-level enemy combatants attempting to blend into the local population. With German resistance collapsing and Salinger no longer exposed to frontline combat, this portion of the war was not as stressful as some of the previous fighting, but Salinger was about to be exposed to one more ghastly wartime experience, and this perhaps was the most horrific. The oldest and one of the largest German concentration camp complexes was centered at Dachau. Subcamps and slave labor locations were scattered throughout the region. Although he never wrote about it or even commented publicly, Salinger is known to have personally liberated a Dachau subcamp known as Kaufering 4, a repository where prisoners too sick to work were sent essentially to die. The camp was evacuated before it was captured. Those prisoners too ill to leave on a forced march were burned alive in their earthen huts. Hundreds of other prisoners who had already died were stacked up in horrific piles. Salinger's only comment about what he saw at this location occurred years later when he told his daughter, "You could live a lifetime, but you'll never get the smell of burning flesh out of your nose." Unfortunately for Salinger and many other combat veterans, witnessing this type of horror on top of the trauma of warfare was a mentally shattering experience. When the German surrender occurred on May 8, 1945, Salinger had served in the military for 3 years, 11 months in the most extreme of circumstances, service that affected him profoundly for the rest of his life. After such a grueling experience, Salinger, like many soldiers, just wanted to go home, but the Army did not oblige. The CIC was obligated to take part in the immediate post-war process known as denazification, and Army counterintelligence would be an integral part of this operation. Salinger and all of his CIC comrades were separated out of their regular Army units and reassigned to a special detachment corps. This development had an extremely negative effect on him, and by July, overwhelmed by depression, he actually checked himself into a hospital. There he met with specialists who were probably quite familiar with what was then called battle fatigue and now referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder. However, this condition was not taken particularly seriously, and after a few weeks, Salinger was discharged. While some individuals self-medicated with various substances or merely suffered in silence, Salinger was able to apply his own therapy of writing, continuing to work on a series of stories concerning the Caulfield family and involving various wartime scenarios, fictionalized from some of Salinger's own experiences. But this attempt at restoring some stability in Salinger's now troubled mindset resulted in a rash, practically irrational act. At the end of May, Salinger was introduced to a woman named Sylvia Welter by Sylvia's sister, Alice, after Salinger offered Alice a ride in his Jeep. An immediate connection must have occurred, because only months later, on October 18, 1945, Salinger and Sylvia Welter were married in a small ceremony in a small German town near Nuremberg. Sylvia was Salinger's age, 26, spoke several languages, and had several degrees, including a doctorate, as well as being strikingly attractive. The marriage occurred despite strict and specific rules against Americans even socializing with German women. Although her father was a dual citizen of Germany and France, Sylvia was in fact German, a situation that Salinger dealt with by most likely using his CIC expertise and forging identification papers that stated that Sylvia was legally French. In November, he was formally discharged from the army, but decided to agree to a 6-month contract to remain in Germany in his role as a CIC investigator. Most likely, this decision was influenced by the newlywed couple's desire to try to adjust to each other in a familiar environment. Although initially passionate, Jerry and Sylvia began to severely clash, and in a pattern that became typical, Salinger withdrew emotionally, not only from his wife, but from most of his family and friends. An avid letter writer, Salinger stopped almost all correspondence except with his mother, to the point that many of his close friends wondered if something terrible might have befallen him. The stress from his domestic situation seems to have also stifled any creativity. Perhaps it was this development that prompted Salinger to propose that the couple move back to the United States, possibly believing that a change of scenery would help him start writing again. In April 1946, Salinger's employment with the U.S. military officially ended. In late April, he, Sylvia, and their schnauzer, Benny, boarded a naval transport ship on the French coast, destined for New York. Unbelievably, the plan was to live in the family apartment on Park Avenue, a living situation that would have been difficult regardless of the personalities involved. But consider that Salinger was introducing a complete stranger, a German with a strong and intelligent personality, into a Jewish household ruled by a domineering wife who idolized her son, and a stereotypical father who already had issues with his son's professional lifestyle dating back to Jerry's teenage years. This only a year after the revelations of the Nazi Holocaust. It was inconceivable, and the result of this decision was quite predictable, especially since the Salinger family was very inhospitable. Sylvia later told a friend that the family was extremely unkind to her. On top of this, there were constant fights with her husband, and that she never cried so much in her life. The situation came to a head when one day she found an airline ticket placed at her spot at the breakfast table. She was gone by early June of 1946. Salinger annulled the marriage, maintaining that his wife had made false representations, but he did not inform his ex-wife of this development. She eventually moved to Switzerland and became an ophthalmologist, but could not get the marriage officially annulled until 1954. Salinger never spoke of the incident, but tried to infer to close friends that Sylvia had some kind of secret past with the Gestapo, and lied about it, and when he found out, the marriage ended. While this is plausible based on some biographical data from Sylvia's frequent and unusual university transfers indicating the possibility that she was an informer, most likely Salinger couldn't bear the utter failure of what was an absurd and poorly conceived union and needed to place blame elsewhere. The family level of hostility could be gauged by the comment years later by Doris Salinger, Jerry's sister, describing Sylvia to Salinger's daughter as resembling Morticia Addams from the television program The Addams Family. Salinger himself would refer to his ex-wife in the future as Saliva instead of Sylvia. This blow-up may not have been coincidental, because just after his return, Salinger also suffered a career setback that would underline a personality trait that only became more prominent as he got older. As a kind of link between his various short story publications and the impending novel that Salinger was now promising to eventually complete, Whit Burnett proposed a collection of already published short stories as a full-length book. This was not a new idea. Burnett and Salinger had kicked the concept around for several years, the project falling through for various reasons, initially based on Salinger's reluctance. In December of 1945, while Jerry was still in Germany, he signed a contract for this anthology, received a $1,000 advance, and was told by Burnett that the volume was as good as published. His return to the U.S. was probably at least partially influenced by the prospect of publication of a new book within months of his arrival. But Burnett had definitely jumped the gun with his own relationships. The publisher Lippincott had an agreement with Story to publish full-length material, and this was the publishing entity Burnett envisioned for the Salinger anthology. Unfortunately, and possibly predictably, the publisher was not enthusiastic about such cutting-edge material and rejected it. It was left to Burnett to break the news to Salinger in a face-to-face Manhattan hotel lunch meeting. It did not go well, Salinger becoming extremely angry, not only by the situation, but also by what he considered the duplicity of Burnett, who he felt had manipulated and lied to him. This professional relationship, which had nurtured Salinger from the very beginning of his literary career, was now irrevocably severed, never to be repaired. Even sadder, as Salinger's career soared and Burnett's profile faded, the editor persisted in requesting to print unpublished material, and Salinger continually refused. Burnett practically reduced to begging. This unfortunate incident also reinforced Salinger's bitter attitude that editors were never to be trusted and that they never really had any regard for the material or writers they trafficked in. By now, Salinger actually had a shorter version of The Catcher in the Rye, a 90-page novella that he impulsively submitted to an editor he was friendly with at Simon & Schuster. Just as quickly, he withdrew it, sensing that it was still not really complete and probably understanding that it could be greatly improved. The writer was probably encouraged by the news that the New Yorker had finally agreed to publish the related Holden Caulfield story, Slight Rebellion on Madison, which they had put in limbo for 5 years. Salinger wrote a thank you note to esteemed editor William Maxwell, also emphasizing that he, the author, would make any changes deemed necessary. This solicitous tone, which contrasted with his previous demands, might have resulted from his additional notice from his agent that the editor would shortly receive a novella and another short story for consideration. Maxwell was good on his word, and J.D. Salinger was featured in the New Yorker for the first time on December 21, 1946, albeit in the back of the magazine surrounded by ads. This career leap at age 28 resonated with the author, who believed it marked an important step in his career. It also may have prompted his move to a remote loft in Tarrytown, New York. Salinger had been spending a great deal of time with other literary pals in Greenwich Village, and enduring parental constraints and the overall distractions of a large city. In early January, Salinger composed a story entitled Banana Fish, concerning an individual named Seymour Glass and his wife Muriel. The New Yorker and Maxwell rejected it, but this time Maxwell appended a personal note to Salinger's agent, stating that there was much to like in the story, and perhaps the author might like to discuss potential revisions personally. Salinger took the editor up on his offer, and despite a year and several other requests for revisions, in January of 1948, the story was published with the revised title, A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. It concerns a vacationing husband and wife in a bleak tale of marital estrangement, Seymour's increasingly erratic behavior after his military service, and ultimately suicide. And it also incorporates a beach interaction between Seymour and a much younger girl. With its publication, Salinger's profile rose greatly on New York's literary scene, although he now decided that he no longer needed or wanted anything to do with the much more commercial periodicals in which he previously published. These entities were certainly not finished with him. Only months before the New Yorker's Banana Fish publication, in a special edition, Cosmopolitan printed his entire novella entitled The Inverted Forest. Although the lengthy work was not well received, that such a publication would release a 30,000-word piece by a writer with only a modest reputation was a sign of Salinger's increasing stature. Good Housekeeping published A Girl I Knew in February of 1948, and Cosmopolitan followed up with Blue Melody in September 1948. Salinger's intent to only write for the New Yorker must have been intensified by title changes in both of the latter two stories, changes again made without any input from him. Contrasted with the personally meticulous input from William Maxwell and others at the New Yorker, it only strengthened the writer's resolve. In early 1948, Salinger moved to a small house in Stamford, Connecticut, a transition to the growing suburban scene mushrooming around metropolitan New York City. Undoubtedly, this contributed to his next New Yorker story, Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut, another realistic but dreary depiction of the life of an unhappy upper-class suburban housewife. The New Yorker then published just before the war with the Eskimos, a piece involving a slice-of-life interaction among teenagers that was baffling but fascinating, a trait of Salinger's stories that was becoming more and more recognizable. In 1949, an incident occurred which had additionally profound effect on Salinger and both his career and attitudes. Inevitably, Hollywood came calling, and Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut was purchased for adaptation to the screen by Samuel Goldwyn. This seemed like a completely reasonable transaction, with Salinger receiving a nice payday and his work getting high-profile exposure. The script was written by Julius and Philip Epstein, the acclaimed authors of Casablanca, and a first-rate production was anticipated. Instead of the suburban angst and unhappiness of the short story, Goldwyn Productions assembled something called My Foolish Heart, a syrupy send-up released in 1950 that had little resemblance to Salinger's story and was described by the New Yorker of all publications as full of soap opera cliches. Salinger relinquished any production control and was appalled by the result, even more so when the film, panned by the critics, was quite popular with an Academy Award nomination for lead actress Susan Hayward and a popular song with the same name as the film's title. This experience completely jaded Salinger towards any future attempts to develop his work into film, an attitude that became especially ingrained as his prominence increased. Salinger and his schnauzer Benny upgraded to an actual home in Westport, Connecticut, and it was here that he would reach the creative pinnacle of his career. First came the short story For Esme with Love and Squalor, a piece that was autobiographical and incorporated Salinger's PTSD in an attempt to depict the difficulties that all veterans returning from the war were experiencing. Published on April 8, 1950, it struck a chord with the public, Salinger receiving more mail about the story in the subsequent 2 weeks following its publication than any other previous effort. Having successfully conquered the literary challenge that was consistent and esteemed publication in the New Yorker, Salinger resolved to finally finish the larger project that had beguiled him for almost 10 years, his novel about the already created but incomplete Holden Caulfield. His challenge was to take the various already written pieces concerning the Caulfield character and assemble a coherent longer story. Salinger spent the summer of 1950 on this undertaking, sometimes in his Connecticut home and sometimes accessing workspace at the Manhattan offices of the New Yorker, depositing himself in whatever office was made available by an editor's vacation. As some of these stories were written as far back as 1941 and as recently as 1948, Salinger also had to implement a consistent voice, attitude, and character. He did not seem unaware of the potential gravitas of this project, isolating himself and embracing various tenets of Zen Buddhist philosophy, the author forever searching for a mental discipline that could counter his tendency towards depression fomented by his wartime experiences. Salinger had actually carried some of the rough early chapters of the Caulfield story on his person during his wartime travails across Europe, as hopefully a talisman to ensure his survival. Upon completion of the book, Salinger must have felt that a great weight was lifted from his shoulders, but it was not surprising that such a remarkable manuscript would also have a remarkable publication history. Part of Salinger's relief was that he also knew exactly what he was going to do with his newly completed work. In the fall of 1949, an editor at the prestigious publishing house of Harcourt, Brace and Company, Robert Giroux, sent a letter to Salinger via the New Yorker, inquiring about the possibility of publishing a collection of the writer's short stories. Typically, Salinger did not respond, but one day in December of the same year, Salinger abruptly showed up at Giraud's Manhattan office without an appointment. His visit so unexpected that Giraud thought it was Pierre Salinger, then an up-and-coming editor and journalist, before Giraud's receptionist corrected him. Salinger got right to the point. He mentioned that a top editor at the New Yorker, William Shawn, had recommended him, but that at that particular moment, Salinger did not wish to publish a collection of stories, but believed that Giraud should publish his first novel. When Giraud immediately requested the manuscript, Salinger told him it was half finished, but he would surely complete it that summer. Giraud shook hands with the author and said he would be delighted to publish the manuscript. Salinger must have been impressed by this enthusiasm because upon completion of the work, he had his agent quickly messenger a copy of the manuscript as promised. Salinger had a similar experience with Jamie Hamilton of the British publisher Hamish Hamilton. Hamilton inquired of the possibility of getting the rights to a short story collection. Instead, Salinger wound up selling him the British rights to Catcher. Seemingly, the heavy lifting for the book, its composition, was behind the author. But the first sign of trouble came when Salinger actually, in appreciation for the role the magazine had played in furthering his career, had his agent send a completed manuscript to the New Yorker. His intent was to have the periodical print perhaps excerpts or even the entire work in serial form. In any case, he expected a very positive reception, or even possibly adulation. Instead, he got a rejection. It was personalized, and the author received very specific feedback, but the ultimate result was that the New Yorker would not print any of The Catcher in the Rye. An even more Byzantine process occurred at Harcourt Brace. Although the story has been embellished to the point of folklore, it does have some consistent details. According to Robert Giraud, upon receiving and reading the manuscript, he was greatly impressed and elated to be involved in such a literary endeavor. Thinking that with an oral agreement and a book of such magnitude, the rest of the publication process would be a formality, Giraud sent the book to Eugene Reynal, a VP at Harcourt Brace. Reynal was a stuffy member of the Social Register and an Ivy League art scholar, the type of pompous individual that the book endlessly lampoons, using both profanity and sarcastic derision. The result was predictable. Reynal negative to the point of claiming that such an edgy book would guarantee controversy and kill the firm's textbook division sales, the financial bedrock of the company. Giraud sheepishly informed Salinger of these developments over another excruciating Manhattan lunch, and perhaps sensing that a very large fish was getting away, pleaded with the author to make some changes and soften the book's unprecedented style and edge. Salinger said nothing, but upon returning to Connecticut, he phoned up Harcourt Brace and summarily demanded the manuscript back. His agent then sent it to Little Brown and Company, who accepted it, and the book seemed back on track until Salinger's endless objections to how the book would be marketed, demanding that no advance copies be distributed, and even fighting over the design of the book jacket itself, drove everyone involved to distraction. When informed via telephone by his editor, John Woodburn, that Catcher had been selected as a Book of the Month Club selection, an unusual distinction for a first novel and a guarantee of popular and financial success, Salinger merely barked, "I suppose that will delay publication, won't it?" The Book of the Month Club, frequently given a head start on a book's public release. Woodburn, thinking that this exchange might positively underline how seriously Salinger took his work, repeated the story to columnists, and when it found its way into the press, the author became angry, believing the anecdote made him look like a jerk. Salinger did sense correctly that publication of Catcher in the Rye would prompt a critical and publicity deluge. He resolved to head for Great Britain, where he hoped to avoid such a process, which he knew he would find sickening. He also hoped to time his return from the UK before the book's release there, for the same reason. He left on the Queen Elizabeth on May 8, 1951, and fortunately Jamie Hamilton was utterly solicitous and completely amenable to any of the writer's publishing-oriented requests. Hamilton also was Salinger's tour guide through the social aristocracy of the British capital, arranging such events as dinner with Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. This perhaps awkward for Salinger, as Holden Caulfield had subjected Olivier to specific criticism. He would feel compelled to clean this up with a subsequent letter of apology via Jamie Hamilton, a letter that generated a polite acknowledgement from Sir Lawrence. Salinger then spent 7 weeks touring England, Scotland, and Ireland, but in the end his curiosity must have gotten the better of him. He returned home on July 11th, 5 days before his novel's publication. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about J.D. Salinger. Information for this podcast came from the books Salinger by Shane Salerno and J.D. Salinger, A Life by Kenneth Slowensky. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. Thank you for listening, and please tell a friend about bite-sized biographies.